So we're having a look at an RDF accounting engine, and we're using Excel for our inputs. We've got our unit types for the investments that we are going to generate a balance sheet and profit and loss in relation to. Got some report details with start and end date for our general reports, balance sheet, profit and loss, cash flow. Anything that relates to historical period will sit behind that date line in terms of a comparative balance sheet and profit and loss. You've got your reporting currency, given that our inputs are going to be in multiple currencies. So you can dynamically choose which currency you're going to generate this report in. We're generating the report at market rather than at cost. So hence why we need our unit values at given points in time for those investments. We've got our transaction verbs which have a relationship with certain accounts. Right, and we've got, as I said, unit values. So on our inputs, we're simply selecting from those transaction verbs in which have a relationship with the accounts and which drive any calculations, particularly when there's investments involved. So these investments are sitting in euro, and you can see we've got invest in, dispose of, and for anything that's sort of sat behind the date line when we had a bank statement, we're simply loading those transactions in from a quasi bank account, which we have two transactions going through. We have the introduction of the capital, which obviously go through your proprietor's capital account, and then you've got your invest in, where you're leveraging a certain amount of euros to secure a certain number of units in a given investment. So let's just see how this will process. So we are going to go to our investment calculator. We run that, give it a moment, let it run. Okay, so you see that we'll run this process using a Prolog calculator. So it's a Prolog engine, Prolog and Python. You can see the requested format here is RDF. So that transaction trail out of Excel was generated as RDF. You've got all your outputs, which would be what you'd expect from a standard business reporting model perspective. And of course, in this case, we've got our investment report here. So our investment report will show, obviously, we've got everything, so anything purchased within the time frame, everything else would have been part of the opening balances, but by the time we get to the end, we've got on hand in the different currencies, and obviously the reporting currency, we've got any gains or losses, and all gains or losses are split between market and Forex, because obviously there's a Forex perspective on all of these investments. And those values will tie back to everything happening on the balance sheet. So if we're looking for balances, we'll find all the balances. So here you can see we've got the final values for those assets, which will match up. And don't forget, this is at market, right? So this is a balance sheet at market. A balance sheet is obviously going to balance, and our current earnings 388,192 versus historical. Remember, we've got that opening date. And if we have a look at our profit and loss, so there's the 388,192. And if we go to our cash flow statement, this is where it starts to get interesting, because here we've started to experiment with providing some access into the graph database. So if we were to have a look through, this is a complete cash flow statement from the perspective of your opening balances all the way down to your closing balances, and you can see all of these values essentially are associated with a vector within the database. So let's have a look at that dollar value, and that will give us access into the actual transaction itself from a graph database perspective. Now, at this stage, we haven't made this human friendly, but at least you can see what we're looking at in terms of accounting data sitting within a graph database, at least an RDF graph database, which makes it even more interesting, because obviously RDF is our global open standard for information representation. So what we've got is a statement with a subject, a statement with an object in relation to obviously the ID on that transaction, and ultimately how we finally represent this from a human-friendly perspective is going to be interesting. And of course, our goal would be to tie this into our, and let's see if I've got my, so of course if you had something like a bank, so Commonwealth Bank, we'll see that this Commonwealth Bank, in terms of all the Australian entities also sitting within this graph database, and so you can imagine how this will sort of hang together in a huge RDF database which you could explore backwards and forwards and inside out essentially.